George Washington executed. The timeline where America never existed history is often written by the victors, but it is best understood by analyzing the losers. The narrative of the United States is built upon the bedrock of the Revolutionary War, a miraculous victory of ragtag, militias over the greatest military power on earth. But when we strip away the patriotism and the myth-making, we are left with a precarious reality. The American victory was not inevitable. In fact, it was a statistical improbability. This leads us to one of the most fascinating intellectual exercises in historical analysis. What if the rebellion had been crushed? What if the United States of America never existed, replaced instead by the British Dominion of North America? To understand this alternate reality, we must first confront the most visceral image of this timeline, the death of George Washington. In our history, he is the father of the nation, a marble saint. In a timeline where the British win, Washington is not a hero. He is a traitor of the highest order. The investigation into British military law of the 18th century suggests a grim fate. Upon the final defeat of the Continental Army, perhaps at Yorktown, had the French fleet failed to arrive, the leadership of the rebellion would have been rounded up. There would be no presidency, no peaceful retirement at Mount Vernon. Washington, Jefferson, and Adams would likely have been transported to London, tried for high treason, and publicly executed. This act would have decapitated the spirit of American independence for generations, replacing the narrative of liberty with the narrative of order. The political structure, the Dominion model in this hypothetical scenario, the 13 colonies would not have remained under direct martial law forever. The British Empire was pragmatic. It is highly probable that, over time, the colonies would have transitioned into a structure similar to Canada or Australia. We would see the formation of the Dominion of North America. Instead of a president residing in the White House, the head of government would be a prime minister, likely operating out of New York or Philadelphia. A governor-general would serve as the ceremonial representative of the British monarch. The political DNA of the continent would be fundamentally different. The American distrust of centralized government, a direct result of the Revolution, would be replaced by the British parliamentary tradition, which emphasizes peace, order, and good government rather than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This seemingly subtle semantic shift changes everything about how a society functions. From gun control laws to healthcare systems, the abolition of slavery, a bloodless transition. Perhaps the most significant divergence in this timeline concerns the institution of slavery. This is the most compelling argument for the British America scenario. In our reality, the United States did not end slavery until 1865, and it required a civil war that claimed over 600,000 lives to do so. However, the British Empire took a different path. The Slavery Abolition Act was passed by the British Parliament in 1833, ending slavery throughout most of the empire. If the American colonies were still part of that empire, the institution of slavery would likely have been dismantled 30 years earlier than it was in our timeline. We must analyze the economic implications of this. The southern colonies would have been furious. The plantation economy relied on forced labor. However, without the political autonomy of an independent nation, the South would have had to contend with the full might of the British Imperial Parliament. Would there have been a rebellion? Possibly. But a rebellion of the southern colonies against the combined might of the northern colonies and the British Empire would have been short-lived. The tragedy of the American Civil War, the brother against brother slaughter, might have been entirely avoided. The transition, while economically painful for the aristocracy, would have saved 500,000 lives and potentially accelerated the civil rights movement by a century. The cultural landscape, spelling and manners culture, is often defined by small habits that accumulate over centuries. The investigation into the cultural drift between the US and the UK reveals fascinating divergences that stem directly from the war. Take, for example, the morning ritual. In our timeline, coffee is the fuel of the American workforce. This was a political choice. After the Boston Tea Party, drinking tea was seen as unpatriotic. In a British America, this boycott never happens. The United States remains a nation of tea drinkers. The coffee break is replaced by afternoon tea. Linguistically, the drift would be corrected. Noah Webster's dictionary, which deliberately simplified English spelling, color versus color, center versus center, to create a distinct American identity, would never have been written. The American accent might have remained closer to the transatlantic accent. Or perhaps the divergence would still happen, but the written word would remain standardized to the King's English. Sports, too, would be unrecognizable. Baseball, an evolution of the British game of rounders, might still exist, but cricket and rugby would likely be the dominant pastimes. The Super Bowl would not exist. Instead, the Dominion of North America would be competing fiercely against Australia and India in the cricket World Cup, westward expansion, and indigenous relations. A crucial area of investigation is the geography of the continent. The American drive for manifest destiny, the belief that the nation was ordained by God to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was a distinctly American creation. The British approach was different. Before the Revolution, the British Crown established the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was done to maintain peace with Native American tribes and to keep the colonies manageable and coastal, where they could be protected and taxed by the Royal Navy. If the British had retained control, westward expansion would have been much slower and more regulated. The genocide and displacement of Native American tribes might have been less chaotic, though the British Empire was certainly not innocent of colonial atrocities. However, the British often viewed indigenous tribes as strategic partners rather than obstacles to be removed. It is possible that a large portion of the American interior would have remained Native American territory for much longer, possibly evolving into a semi-autonomous buffer state. The map of North America would look radically different, perhaps shared between the British Dominion in the east, native confederacies in the Midwest, and Spanish or Mexican territories in the west. The geopolitical butterfly effect. Finally, we must consider the global stage. If the United States and the British Empire were one single entity, the balance of power in the 19th and 20th centuries would be overwhelmingly tilted. Consider the world. Wars in our timeline. The U.S. entered World War I and World War II late, eventually tipping the scales. In a timeline where North America is British, the immense resources, manpower, and industrial capacity of the continent would have been available to Britain from day one of any conflict. Germany, looking at a British Empire that spanned from London to Vancouver to Sydney to Calcutta, might never have dared to start World War I. The sheer monolithic power of such an empire would act as a massive deterrent. The rise of the Soviet Union might have been checked much earlier. The 20th century, rather than being the American century, would have been the second century of the Pax Britannica. Conclusion. The price of independence. In concluding this investigation, we find ourselves facing a complex paradox. The United States gained independence, created a dynamic democracy, and became a beacon of innovation. But the cost was high. A century of slavery, a bloody civil war, and the decimation of the native population. A British America represents a timeline of stability. It is a timeline of evolution rather than revolution. It offers a slower, perhaps gentler path to modernity, where slavery ends sooner and the rule of law prevails over the rule of the gun. However, it also represents a world with less radical freedom, a world where the chaotic, beautiful experiment of American self-governance Never happened not to look at the stars and stripes today is to see a symbol of defiance. But to look at the alternate history is to wonder if the quiet, orderly, tea-drinking dominion of North America might have been a safer, if less exciting, place to call home. The halo effect of the American Revolution convinces us that independence was the only moral path, but a cold analysis suggests that remaining within the empire might have yielded a more humane result for millions of people. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video, learned something new, or simply want to see more content like this, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps the channel grow and reach more people. And if you have thoughts or ideas you'd like to share, feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.